The moment Russian cities began feeling the shockwaves of collapsing industries, shrinking budgets, and exhausted regiments, the scale of Vladimir Putin's crisis became impossible to hide. Defense spending had swallowed the economy. Veterans were returning home sick, broken, and angry. Regions already struggling before the war now faced shortages that no amount of propaganda could conceal. And yet, even as Russia's system strained under the pressure, one fact stayed unchanged. Putin still rejected negotiations. He still refused every peace proposal. He still insisted that the war must continue, despite mounting costs. But to understand why he keeps pushing forward as his own country crumbles, we need to rewind. The war was never supposed to look like this. In early 2022, the expectation, both inside and outside Russia, was that Ukraine would fall quickly. Instead, the conflict stretched into years, with Ukraine resisting, adapting, and striking back with force. Putin has watched his military suffer astonishing losses, while Ukraine, much smaller and initially outgunned, held the line and even shattered parts of Russia's economy. Yet despite this, Putin refuses to sit at a negotiating table. He brushes off peace proposals. He maintains the course. On the surface, it may appear irrational, but experts who have studied his behavior argue that several forces, political, psychological, military, and geopolitical, are pushing him to keep fighting, and understanding his refusal means following the timeline of how his stance hardened. When the invasion began, Putin framed the operation as limited. He claimed Russia was stepping in to protect people in Donbass, repeating fabricated accusations of genocide and Nazism in Ukraine's eastern regions. His words still define the war's earliest narrative. The purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime. To this end, we will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as well as bring to trial those who perpetrated numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including against citizens of the Russian Federation. He named 4 regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, as the targets of this so-called mission. In September 2022, he went further by officially annexing all 4 regions, even though Russian forces did not fully control any of them. He declared they would be part of Russia forever. But Russian troops also pushed into Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy, and launched countless missile and drone attacks across Ukraine, striking cities far beyond the Donbass. Although presented as limited, operations expanded nationwide. And over time, Putin's rhetoric shifted too. He began stressing not just the 4 annexed regions, but the idea of Ukraine as a whole belonging to Russia. The clearest moment arrived on June 20th, 2025, at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Standing on stage, Putin said, "I have said many times that I consider the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be one people. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours." For years, analysts suspected he wanted more than Donbass. With that statement, he confirmed it. According to Guillaume Duval of the Jacques Delors Institute, Putin never cared deeply about the economic value of Donbass itself. Duval noted that the region had been devastated and offered little real benefit. Vladimir Putin possesses little genuine interest in the Donbass and Luhansk regions themselves. These territories now lie devastated, their infrastructure reduced to ruins. Their economies were dominated by coal mining and largely obsolete heavy industries that will contribute precious little to Russia's economic future. Duval argued that Putin's main objective was far larger, gaining control over Ukraine's political destiny and turning it into another Belarus, officially separate, but effectively an extension of Russia. Putin sees this war as a battle for power and legacy. He already rules the world's largest country, yet wants more territory and more influence. In his view, a Ukraine aligned with the European Union or NATO would represent a strategic defeat. A Ukraine supported by Western alliances, especially the United States, would sit directly on Russia's border. He considers that an unacceptable threat to his autocratic regime. The war for him is therefore both offensive and defensive, expanding Russia's sphere of influence while blocking NATO and the EU from gaining ground. And because he has not achieved total control over Ukraine, he sees no reason to stop fighting. As long as he believes Russian forces are making meaningful gains, or will eventually break Ukrainian resistance, he will continue. But there is another problem. Putin may not know how bad the situation really is. In authoritarian systems, accurate assessments may not consistently reach the top. Those who deliver bad news risk losing their jobs, influence, or even their lives. Modern Russia has become a place where political opponents, critics, and even high-ranking insiders can disappear. Figures like Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny paid the highest price. In July 2025, former Transport Minister Roman Starovoyt was found dead hours after being dismissed. This environment has revived an old pattern. Officials tell the leader what he wants to hear. Putin receives briefings from generals and intelligence chiefs who understand the dangers of contradicting him. Rather than honest assessments, they offer exaggerated successes and minimized losses. As Duval explains, in autocratic regimes such as Putin's, delivering honest assessments to leaders often proves perilous. Putin remains flattered by the courtiers surrounding him and systematically misinformed by his generals' misleading reports. Evidence suggests this is happening already. For example, in October 2025, General Valery Gerasimov claimed Russian forces controlled over 70% of Vovchansk in Kharkiv. The Institute for the Study of War quickly countered. ISW has not observed evidence to support Gerasimov's claims. ISW has only observed evidence to assess that Russian forces have seized roughly 23% of Vovchansk. Even Russian military bloggers challenged the official numbers, but these facts matter less than what Putin believes. If he is repeatedly told victory is close, negotiations seem unnecessary. And this same distortion shapes his understanding of the economy. Advisors hide the depth of sanctions damage. They hide the structural decay. They present a facade of stability. Duval notes that Russia's economic leaders attempt to conceal from Putin the extent of structural decay and the mounting impact of Western sanctions. As long as Putin hears that Russia is strong, he has no incentive to compromise. Even if he did know the truth, ending the war has become nearly impossible without triggering a national crisis. Russia has thrown everything into the conflict. Defense now consumes close to 40% of federal spending. Other sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, mining, have shrunk. Entire regions rely on war contracts and military salaries. Stopping the war would collapse the military-industrial complex overnight. Unemployment would spike. Hidden economic problems would surface all at once. And hundreds of thousands of veterans would return home with trauma, injuries, and chronic illnesses, including reports of serious chronic illnesses among mobilized personnel in mobilized units. Russia's healthcare system is not prepared for that wave. Social instability would rise, labor shortages would deepen. In many ways, the war is holding the country together, not strengthening it, but preventing complete collapse. Ending the war might accelerate that collapse, something Putin cannot risk. There is also the matter of China. As Russia became isolated from the West, it grew dependent on Beijing for goods, components, electronics, vehicles, drones, and financial support. China also became one of Russia's most important energy customers. This dependency gives Xi Jinping immense leverage. Duval argues that Russia now teeters on the brink of becoming Beijing's junior partner dependency. And from China's perspective, the war benefits its strategic interests. It distracts the West from Asia. It drains US and NATO resources. It pushes Russia deeper into China's orbit. It strengthens China's bargaining position on technology, energy, and future infrastructure deals. For those reasons, Beijing has no desire to see the conflict end in a US-brokered peace deal, especially not one that Donald Trump could claim credit for. Such a diplomatic win would boost America's global standing and potentially rebuild ties between Moscow and the West. China cannot allow that. So while Chinese officials speak publicly about peace, their strategic incentives point the other way. All these forces, conquest, misinformation, economic survival, and foreign pressure, shape Putin's refusal to end the war. Peace talks have failed, not because they were poorly designed, but because Putin has powerful reasons to reject them. The conflict will likely continue until Russia faces a decisive military defeat, or sanctions so severe that the economic crisis can no longer be hidden from the Kremlin. Until that day arrives, Russia will keep pushing forward, and Putin will continue trying to mask underlying weaknesses forming across his country. To understand where Russia goes from here, explore how the nation is, in the words of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, running out of money, troops, and ideas. Or see how Ukrainian sabotage teams are undermining Russia from within, accelerating a collapse that Putin can no longer fully control.